couldn't find their way in. So I'll start with the introduction, and then that'll give us a little bit of time for people to wander in. So the reason I asked Michelle to do this presentation was because I heard her present at SDS, and I was listening to the presentation and I was like, wow, I could just, everything she said was like absolutely right on. Yes, this is my experience. This is what I found myself. So it was very exciting to me to listen to it. And then but she was actually one of the first ones that sort of gave me the idea to actually do these events, because it occurred to me that something like the Society for Disability Studies, you have these people who do research that impacts the lives of people with disabilities, and it's other people who do research that hear about it. And those people who are just ordinary folk with disabilities never hear about it. And you know, some of it is maybe beyond what, you know, the everyday person really is interested in, but lots of it is not, or at least pieces of it are not. And so so really, Michelle was like one of the very first persons that really inspired me to do this. And she was the very first person that I actually asked to do a presentation. And so when she said it, was like, okay, I can do this because Michelle's going to help me. And you know, it was really, I mean, really, I have you to owe for all of this. Everyone can owe you for this because it inspired me.
Thank you.
Because I really think that ableism is something that all of us with disabilities live with. And sometimes the ableism is subtle, and some of it is quite profound. And some of it is, you know, people who are very well-meaning can be ableists. And in fact, other people with disabilities can be ableists. And I think it's an important thing for us to understand why it exists, what we can do about it, you know, what's successful. When I listened to you, it was like, you addressed all those issues. So I'm really looking forward to this, and based on how many people expressed interest in coming, I think there's other people who are also. So take it away, Michelle.
Excellent. So can you hear me okay?
Yes.
And I just want to thank Susan so much. I never knew that backstory, but I appreciate the opportunity. She's done a lot to organize these ADA Michigan 30 events. There's more coming. I plan to attend. And I also want to thank the sponsors, Michigan Arts Access, and also the Great Lakes ADA Center. I need to come visit Detroit area. So I'll start by saying we decided to give away one of my books, which was just published. We move to this screen, for the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. And I have a few that I can also give at a discount. I'll share that at the end. But even though this is a book that includes a lot of academic information about what do we know about disability prejudice, ableism, what does it look like, how has it changed over the years, are there new forms, can I be ableist, where does it come from, and then who does it impact? Not necessarily just people with disabilities. It impacts the broader society when we think about all of the contributions that are not being fully realized. What solutions work? There have been lots of interventions out there to reduce prejudice, to reduce ableism, to raise awareness, and they don't all work the same. So I had been hoarding this information. I decided to pull it all together. It took me about 4 years. And we will offer a free copy of the book for I guess the first person that types into the chat, when was the term ableism first used? This is Susan's idea. I had to look it up myself for the book. But if you're interested, stick around till the end, and I have some other things I can offer as well. So this is what the book looks like. This is the table of contents. I love the cover because it shows an image of a almost like a cyborgian female emerging out of this wall of maze, this entrapment, if you will, is how I interpret that the statue is coming out of it, which indicates that while disabled people are still constrained by a lot of prejudice and discrimination, the group is emerging, things are changing, and we can all do more to improve our circumstances when it comes to reducing ableism. So I'll start by sharing that ableism, again, to define it simply, is just prejudice against people who experience any number of physical, mental, chronic health conditions that are the targets of discrimination, prejudice, and that impedes their participation from contributing as full citizens. So if that's the terminology that we're going to be dealing with, I recognize that this is not a comfortable subject for a lot of people. And yet for the next 40 minutes is what I've timed this to be. I want to show some examples of how this form of prejudice impacts people, what it looks like, and how disability advocacy can help. According to the most recent US Census, we know that disabled people are everywhere. As this tree signifies, they are not just our grandparents or our individual selves. They are parents themselves. People with disabilities can be parents. They are sisters, brothers, lovers, lawyers, and executives, although we don't see near enough examples. Disabled people are also politicians and are making changes. 1 in 5 people currently experience disability, although the CDC puts that number closer to 1 in 4. So the largest minority group of the United States is what we're talking about here. And most of us, whether we anticipate it or whether we welcome disability or not, will probably experience a disabling condition, even if temporarily, at some point during the lifetime, if we don't already. It's more a question of when than if, when we think about the fluid nature of our abilities and our physical, bodily, and cognitive limitations that can be disrupted by injury, accidents, temporary illness, and more permanent accidents as well. So we call this an open enrollment group, which makes it a little bit different than some of the other prejudices, the other isms out there. So to simplify things, I have broken up the ABCs of ableism to include our attitudes or our emotions, our behaviors, actions, and practices, including those enshrined in policies, and our thoughts and cognitions, the C, our beliefs, our ideologies. And we might argue that while it's similar to racism and ageism, which is prejudice against older adults, ableism is all about the assumptions that we make about whose lives are worth living and why certain people, certain bodies, need to be controlled according to other people or protected or somehow improved upon. At least that's the assumption. I'm a social psychologist, and so in my field, ableism involves these 3 domains: our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions, both as individuals and as organizations and broader groups. So what I would like to do is mention a couple things before we get started. This is the anniversary of the ADA. And even though we just talked about on this slide how disabled people are everywhere.
Excuse me, Michelle.
Yes.
But we have not been able to see any of your slides.
Oh my goodness. Let me hit stop share and reshare and see if that's the case for Susan. Is that your experience as well?
Well, I wasn't seeing them, but I assumed that was because I was the host here.
Well, everybody's been saying that they haven't been seeing anything.
See them now? I'm screen.
Yes.
Now I'm seeing it.
Yay. Okay, good. Well, I just was giving a little introduction. So I was talking about the book And this is the image of the book. Thank you for interrupting. I really appreciate that. And we're going to give away a book and maybe offer some at a discount at the end. And I'm glad to be going back because I wanted to make mention of something specific to this slide that shows that 1 in 5 people currently are experiencing any number of disabilities in the United States. It's the largest minority group, and that there are aunts, our uncles, our grandparents, but also our parents themselves, maybe executives, maybe lawyers, artists, and activists. And yet, and this is where it becomes relevant to the ADA's 30th anniversary, when we survey nationally across the country, we find that Americans still don't agree on what qualifies as a disability, even though there are clear definitions in the ADA. So when you ask people, do they have consensus around what disability means and who qualifies, people will say things like mental illnesses like schizophrenia and depression or addiction, invisible conditions like learning disabilities. Some people don't think they should qualify. So there's still quite a bit of work to do. In 2008, when the ADA amendments were passed, the ADA had excluded protection from people with medical conditions that could be fixed through medicine, and that has since changed. So we know things change, but it is true that less than 5 years ago, over half of Americans believed that speech, language, and learning disabilities, less than 58% thought that those should qualify as disabling conditions. And that's a nationally representative sample. It's even worse, if you will, among older adults who are less willing to concede that there are conditions out there that we call disabilities that disable people from full access and participation. And then I was just sharing about how this is an open enrollment group that anyone can join, and this may be why it is a difficult conversation. Unlike racism or race, and to some extent queer identification and gender, this is a group anyone can join, and many of us will if we haven't already. It's more a question of time. And then we were just getting into the ABCs of ableism. As a social psychologist, this is how we study prejudice, which is my area of expertise. So like racism and like ageism, prejudice against older adults, disability prejudice or ableism is really all about the assumptions that we make about whose lives are worth living and whose lives need to be controlled or somehow improved. So as we go through, I want to share examples of how the ways in which people experience ableism have changed over time. Since the ADA has passed and before, they've shifted, because when we find ourselves in a different legislative landscape where people are increasingly working together who have disabilities and who don't, even though still 30% of people with disabilities have jobs, leaving the bulk of people without full-time employment. We do know there's hope because we do know that things have changed with policies. The ADA shifted the dynamics between how people interact and what's considered illegal. And so we know that ableism takes a variety of different forms. And the first form I want to sort of begin to talk about has to do with fear. And this is some of the earliest information that was studied formally about disability prejudice, the fears that people have. And I'll be describing these images as well. This comes under the emotional reactions to disabled people or the notion of disability, that form of prejudice that we're talking about. And these are different.
Michelle, I think you muted yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
I don't know. I think I moved my Zoom bar, might have hit the mute. So we're starting with the form of prejudice, disability prejudice, that focuses on fear and disgust. It's one of the oldest forms that has been studied. The images on this slide show pictures of babies with cleft palates, people that are born with facial birthmarks, perhaps red marks or burns that may affect their skin and face. Some people are born with congenital arm or leg amputations. And what we see pretty universally and across cultures is that often, but not always, people react to those with more visible conditions like these in disgust. They make faces like this boy in the center here that's going to pop up, with his tongue sticking out, with his eyes scrunched up, the nose scrunched up, as a universal facial expression that signifies disgust. And I think people don't even realize that they're doing it sometimes, and yet it can be incredibly harmful to those on the receiving end of these reactions and lead to all kinds of internalized ableist ideas. So my question when I was reviewing this information is, why is this? If we can't catch disability, in most cases, maybe with polio aside, which is now remediated, if people typically can't catch disabling conditions like we catch the flu, why do people act as though that other people are contagious or contaminated? And around the world, we do see that disabled people are treated as if they are contagious. They are shunned. They are isolated. They are cast outside, even though they pose no risk of infecting other people. And they get responses like we've been talking about. There was a quote that we collected in a study of people's experiences of the different forms of ableism back in 2019. A particular participant in our study who is born blind said, "Students didn't want to sit by me. They asked to be moved out of my class because they thought they could catch blindness. And I hated this time of my life. I cried every day." So we know that these are irrational fears. We know that people who have family members with disabilities, and particularly visible, do not have these same kinds of reactions. And so people can override perhaps their automatic biases that may have been left over from some evolutionary adaptation that said, stay away from dangerous pathogens, stay away from people who may look sick, even if they're not contagious. And it's interesting that even contemporary studies that look at people with mental illnesses, for example, or psychiatric disabilities, when someone else finds out that they have that label, they're less likely to want to touch objects that those people have touched before, even if they're not currently touching them. They don't want to wear used clothing of people with certain disabilities, and they don't want to swim in the same pools. So we still see this in systematic studies around the world, that there's this bias toward fear. And part of that may have to do with a fear of catching, an irrational, overgeneralized fear of contamination that needs to be addressed. This particular form of ableism was, if you will, enshrined in some laws that were on the books when I was a young person in the 60s. Those laws were called the ugly laws, where cities actually prohibited people with visible disabilities from appearing in public because they were considered unsightly and disgusting. And so people were precluded under penalty of a fee or a fine from going to churches, certain churches, from showing up in public restaurants. And those laws became less and less enforceable and enforced, but were still on the books even through the 70s. So this is an example of some of the implications of some of these fears that we see. I just want to be sure I don't miss anything. I didn't read the Chicago Municipal Code, but I basically described that not just Chicago, but other cities had these ugly laws. And when people with disabilities remind us of our perhaps human animal natures, the fact that we all break, that we all can become injured, that we all are aging and deteriorate at different rates, that may be an unwanted reminder. People may not want to be reminded of their own vulnerability to a group that anyone can join. And so as a consequence, they may avoid disabled people, shun them, and even establish rules that keep them on the margins. We also see that these kinds of incidents can lead to hate crimes. And a hate crime occurs when someone deliberately targets a person with a disability because of their disability to humiliate or attack them. According to the US Bureau of Justice, who tracks these crimes, disabled people are 1.5 times more likely to have been victimized by violent crimes than their non-disabled counterparts. And they're more than twice as likely to be raped and sexually assaulted. Hate crimes, unfortunately, toward disabled people are on the rise since the inauguration of our current president in 2014. To give an example, in my own city, a suburb known as Bay Village, you may remember the Ice Bucket Challenge, where people were working to raise awareness about ALS and pouring ice buckets over their heads. And a group of teenagers in this Cleveland suburb decided to pour urine and feces over the head of a young teenager with autism. That crime was identified as a hate crime and was prosecuted as such. But I will tell you that these are often not tracked, not reported. People are often afraid of reporting, especially because oftentimes the perpetrator of violence and abuse may be one's own personal care attendant, or even family member or partner. So I'll read this quote from Mark Sherry. Disability hate crimes are more common when the perpetrator knows the victim. Yet police are also more likely to drop charges when there's a pre-existing relationship. And some of the documented incidents that I'm trying to make students more aware about have included everything from beating someone with their crutch, to being dumped out of their wheelchair deliberately, set on fire, over-medicated, even murdered. Some states, and I meant to look this up for Michigan, so feel free to do so. I know Tennessee is a state that is looking at disability hate crimes and tracking them specifically and working on more legislation to better address this, but not all states are. So that would be something to think about with respect to Michigan. Ableism is also about dehumanization and beliefs that characterize disabled people as less than human or as animalistic. So on this particular slide, I show a picture of a human hand embracing, if you will, the paw of what looks like a big brown dog, to signify that we are all animals, and yet across cultures, there are many who endorse the belief that humans are superior to animals. And some of those beliefs are, justified by religious doctrines and so forth. But it's interesting that when you study prejudice and you see that some people who believe that disabled people are less than human are also the same people that endorse these notions that humans are superior to animals. So the more people think that humans are superior, the more prejudice they tend to espouse, the more ableism they espouse as well. People with disabilities, as you probably well know from your own personal experiences, are frequently depicted in less than human terms. Philosophers still disagree over whether those with intellectual disabilities even qualify as persons. And in several residential facilities, institutions, nursing homes, if you will, one of the consequences of these attitudes and philosophies is that people can save money on heat by failing to pump warm air in the winter into prisons and nursing homes if people with disabilities are thought incapable of feeling cold or incapable of feeling pain. That justifies for some that maybe we don't need to medicate. And so I just want folks to be aware of how these different forms of ableism have real life consequences in terms of the beliefs that and practices that justify their continuation. This slide talks about restraints and seclusions and how last year in 2019, right? I mean, people, we would think that we've moved beyond with full inclusion, fully legal, moved on sort of segregated settings and barbaric techniques. But the ACLU in February, and I've hyperlinked this here, I'll make this available to folks, did a report called "It's Time to Make Sure Our Kids Are No Longer Bound, Shackled, and Locked Away While They're in School." School districts justified restraints and seclusions necessary protection against people who may harm themselves. And I think this is a difficult conversation because there are some self-injurious behaviors that some folks may enact, and yet is chaining and shackling and isolation the answer? Often people act out when they are not heard, when they are thought to not have a voice or anything to say, and people impose controls over their arm flapping or whatever it might be that comforts. So the important point here is that you have to ask schools what their policies are, because often families are not even aware that schools may have these policies. I mentioned earlier that ableism is often a set of practices that are justified. So these feelings that we have that may be fear-based, these actions that people take that may be avoidant for fear of contagion or becoming disabled, and we don't want to think about that, are often in need of rationalizations, because otherwise people would look biased. They would look like they were discriminating. They would look prejudiced. And so instead they come up with a set of rationalizations for why they need to seclude or change students, for example. And that's what I mean by justification beliefs, that ableism is often justified, and we need to push back against some of those belief systems. So here's an example of how justifications for the value of disabled lives are presented very differently when we talk about suicide. Suicide is a nationally illegal practice. We work very hard to protect people from taking their own lives. I work in higher ed, and there's all kinds of programs that are protective of students. And yet what you see on the right, this is a cartoon that's in the public domain. You see a power wheelchair user caught between a couple of different potential interventions. One that says suicide prevention program, but if she were to attend, there would be no way in because the entryway is blocked by a set of stairs. However, there's a suicide assistance program that has a ramp built to it to, again, signify that we may assume life with disability is so tragic that it's easy to justify mercy-based approaches, even in cases of non-terminal conditions, just because people assume that life is not quality living. So Not Dead Yet is one of the activist groups that works to challenge these assumptions. I was born in 1964, and I'm considered a baby boomer, the last of the baby boomers. And during that time, we were not really told much about this, but 65,000 Americans had been euthanized, disabled Americans involuntarily, I should say involuntarily sterilized. Nice.
Good.
But thanks to disability advocacy, we know that things have changed. Several US governors have issued formal apologies for violating people's right to bear children. And yet we do know that this is an ongoing ableist practice that discourages many young adults and adults who want to have parents but who experience disability themselves from exercising that basic human right. So involuntary sterilization is just one example. There are many examples of parents who have thought to tie the tubes of or control the reproductive organs of their children so that they stay perpetually as children. And I understand there are very difficult decisions involved in that, but I just want us to be thinking about this as one way that the message continues to be perpetuated that disabled people can't be parents. And the research shows that they can be parents. Even people with intellectual disabilities with the proper supports can be parents. I know I needed support when I was a young parent. We are all interdependent on our support systems. And I want to put a shout out to my colleague, Alette Coble Temple, who put together a campaign you can see more of online called Parental Rights Include Disability Equality. And it's all about providing resources to parents with disabilities who may need additional supports to just be parents. This is a map that shows from the parentalrights.org organization, the states that still include disability as grounds for termination of parental rights, 35 states. And so this is something that we need to continue to talk about and work toward dismantling. Many of you have heard about the different models that have been proposed, but I bring this one up here for a particular reason. We know that the ADA and disability advocates, like many of you here today, have worked very hard to challenge the idea, the predominant view that disability is something located inside of the person's body, mind. The image on the right shows that this medical model of disability tends to blame the individual as the problem. The individual's behaviors are the problem, the way the individual looks, the fact that the individual doesn't walk or doesn't speak or has a different way of moving in the world. And that has been the way the public has come to understand disability, because that's the way disability has predominantly been represented. Biomedical explanations equate disability with impairment, and they expect disabled people to fit into the existing environment as it is. That stands in sharp contrast to a recognition that people with impairments are also disabled by society, perhaps primarily disabled by society's attitudes, by architectural barriers, by educational restrictions and economic disincentives that are neither natural nor inevitable. So I show this playground. This is what some of you may recognize as a barrier-free playground. It shows two different kinds of swings for different kinds of bodies, some with more support. There are no bark chips. The ground is level in terms of the surfacing. And from personal experience, I can share that people who tend to view disability as only a condition of the body will make the following assumption. Here comes a kid rolling down the way in her wheelchair. She can't play on a typical playground that has bark chips. And people say, well, that makes sense because her legs are paralyzed. Of course she's not on the playground and she's sitting on the margins. What they fail to understand, however, or at least imagine, is that human decisions create the spaces that we find ourselves in our neighborhoods, create the width of the sidewalks, and can do things differently. And so people may fail to consider how maybe it's the bark chips, maybe it's the nature of the equipment that is preventing this particular little girl from accessing the swings. And we can change those human decisions. Human decisions also determine whether there will be a ramp, whether there will be an elevator, signs, and how public spacing is to be arranged. And humans can make different decisions, especially if disabled voices are involved advocating for how things can be done differently. We have lots of best practice models out there. According to the social or the social political model of disability, disabled people are a disadvantaged minority. And I really think this cannot be stated strongly enough, that despite differences within the group and different forms of impairment and different sizes and shapes, we always see greater diversity within a group than we do between groups. We don't think of disabled people as a cohesive minority, because I think if we did, we would recognize the lobbying power of the largest minority group in the United States. And it's a group that has already come together to share their common experiences with misrepresentations, with exclusions, with barriers. We know that if you ask disabled people, if you take the time to get their opinions, in study after study, the most common difficulties that disabled people describe are not those related to their particular impairments or bodily pains, but they come from policies and practices that fail to treat them as other humans and as citizens, and that make assumptions about the tragedy of their lives as opposed to the fulfilling nature of their lives. And this is just an image of what the social model sort of purports to espouse, that it's not the individual that's the problem, it's the invisible policies and often taken for granted ways in which we arrange our chairs or think about who we invite to the beach, if you will. In terms of stereotypes, this was my early introduction into the field of disability studies. I was really interested in why people who were either deaf or blind or physically impaired or had a mental health condition were all assumed to have some of the same stereotypes that described them and their characteristics. It was as though there was a gestalt of disabled people in general who are thought to be angry, resentful, pitiable, incompetent like Mr. Magoo, or like Dopey from Snow White. And even though these are older Disney images, there have been many a study that look at cross-impairment stereotypes and how these continue to influence employers who may think, well, this person's going to need to be helped, as opposed to this disabled person can be a helper, has competencies, is more familiar with certain things and can be a tutor to others. We know that language has been biased and that over time, thanks to the ADA, language has changed. And some of you may know about Beth Haller and her work on media bias. And I'm looking for something specifically I have to share with you about language that relates to the ADA. Before the ADA, so in 1990, the New York Times and the Washington Post were publicizing all kinds of articles about disability, and some of the most popular were the articles about the people that were exceeding expectations, the super crips, if you will, who are doing amazing things, these human interest stories that we see. And yet if you follow their articles for the 10-year period following the passage of the ADA, you see that the use of the word handicap really goes out of favor. And it becomes more specific to environmental restrictions as handicapping conditions. We don't see that word as much anymore. But sadly, the rise in the use of the terms confined to one's wheelchair or suffering with or imprisoned by X piece of equipment were actually increased since 1990, or at least until 2000. I don't know the status of whether they've tried to update that study, but that would be a great study for someone to do. How has language changed? And how do we continue to change language as a way of disrupting ableism in our terminology? Psychology is one of the worst offenders. This is my field. We constantly say they're blind to condition, or how do we make people less aware? Well, why don't we just say less aware? Why do we have to say blind? It's just become part of the normative parlance. We say lame duck. I know someone from Portland, Oregon was trying to reclaim the term lame as a positive signifier. That one hasn't caught on as well as crip ancestor and crip culture has. But we still see these terms, and I'd love to talk about them further and get opinions about what people think we should be doing to educate others, even in our social media, when they use terms unintentionally. We can confront those folks and educate in polite ways. So far we've talked about fear, a little bit about behaviors and policies and implications of dehumanizing assumptions and stereotypes. But there are also emotional reactions that relate to what some people call positive ableism. I don't like that word. Benevolent ableism. When people are—
Condescending ableism.
Pardon me?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know it was on. Condescending ableism.
Condescending ableism. When people are given pity and sympathy sometimes, and this is complicated too, because I know sometimes I appreciate when my mother gives me sympathy, or someone who's been in my circumstances and they get it. But oftentimes what this translates into is treating disabled people as infants, not as adults, as using words like hun and sweetie that are very condescending, as Judith mentioned, and can lead to some pretty dangerous consequences. People have been more than willing to provide help to those who they deem as the group that needs help, right? So unwanted help giving can put people in compromising physical positions. If they're holding onto crutches, trying to manage a doorway, and someone flings open that door, is trying to help instead of asking first, do you need any assistance? And then the person falls down. I see this a lot in college campuses, and it only becomes ableist if people are providing this unwanted help specifically to certain groups, again, of disabled people. People don't want pity. They may want understanding and recognition and assistance and interdependent opportunities at home. But often when we think about pity, we think about how, would I want a friend who pitied me? Would I want to be employed by someone who pitied me? And how can we, again, change some of these kinds of reactions? Pity is not the only reaction that disabled people get when they are thought to be competing for resources. And so a more contemporary form of ableism, I would argue, it's always been around, but it seems to be around even more so the more we see disabled people out in public, exercising their civil and human rights, parking in places that are reserved for folks with mobility impairments or heart conditions, and people envy those accommodations. They may get angry when they see someone without a visible disability parking in a disability parking space. And that can lead to a form of ableism that can lead to some backlash and to some anger and to hate crimes when people do things like deface your car or call you a faker. There's an image that's supposed to be a humorous image on the left of a parking space for a disabled driver, and yet it's bound by some kind of curb that no one can use. But the joke is that, I'm not jealous of your disability parking. And jealousy can come in places of employment too, when they may observe that someone may get extra accommodations. And I think we have a lot of work to do. Invalidation is another form of contemporary ableism that seems to be differentially targeting to people who have less visible conditions, who are told, we just don't believe you have a disability, or how could you possibly have a traumatic brain injury, as this quote indicates, because you seem so normal. Or, you know, we may want to include our family members in dinners and events, and maybe they're tired from working all day, or from wheeling, or from otherwise dealing with ableist assumptions. And so that fatigue may take a toll, and people may need to have more restful periods, and may experience ableism from their own families when they're encouraged to come and sit at the table or participate when they may be fatigued, and we just can't see that fatigue, so we invalidate. And the final sort, not the final, but the other more contemporary form of ableism that people are increasingly talking about is the objectification that some minority groups get, disabled people in particular, I think, that treat them as objects of inspiration, not for doing inspiring things, but for doing everyday tasks that would be considered typical for anyone else. Going to college, taking public transit. Oh, that's so amazing. I never knew you people could do such a thing. How do you manage to get out of bed? I would just want to kill myself if I were you. These are all things our disabled participants shared with us, and that are included, woven through the book as quotations from people's actual lived experiences. You see on the left here, an image that's made the rounds under the banner of inspiration porn, inspiration pornography. And the reason it's called that is because the idea is that this is supposed to make non-disabled people feel better about themselves by objectifying disabled peers. So the woman in the wheelchair has a graphic above her saying, never ignore someone with a disability. You don't realize how much they can inspire you. As if the population is there to inspire the non-disabled, and share if you agree. You know, when I see these things, I do my best to try to educate and push back in social media circles. Instead, you can post something like this on the left. It appears to be a young woman with a coffee cup who may experience Down syndrome, and it says, don't be surprised when she gets her driver's license, graduates from high school, goes to the prom, gets married, gets a job. So inspiration, again, I don't think we're arguing that disabled people aren't deserving of praise and admiration, but I think when it becomes this form of objectifying, low expectation based inspiration porn, what we're giving people is not admiration. It's more of this paternalistic variety instead of acknowledgement. So I want to switch gears now and talk just a little about how we can think about these forms of ableism as a way to advocate further for anti-ableist practices and in our own communities, in our own homes, in our own organizations. Anyone and everyone can do something. The definition of advocacy is a set of practices that draws on not only scientific information, like that's been collated in the book with accessible language for folks to parse, but political information, moral arguments, in order to press for policies that improve the life outcomes for people with disabilities. So what does that look like? There have been advocacy efforts for more competitive wages. So we see people quoting statistics on those who have increased working opportunities for people with disabilities. I've been a part of a group called Disability Matters. Springboard Consulting is all about encouraging CEOs from Fortune 500 companies and other large companies to employ disabled people, and they've seen progress. But then, are the wages as competitive? Are the promotions forthcoming? Where is the enforcement of the ADA that's now 30 years old when a complaint is filed, or when something is brought up? Maybe a complaint doesn't need to be filed if something is addressed that is outside of compliance. But people forget that just because the ADA has passed doesn't necessarily mean that it's enforced, or that people, there's funding to monitor and to seek out and investigate claims against businesses who fail to meet the requirements of the law. Maybe they fail to see the benefits to their business of opening the door to the broader community. Affordable health care, advocacy for representation in leadership roles, and professional development opportunities. What I'm trying to do on my college campus is to infuse faculty development with inclusive excellence models and practices that include anti-racist pedagogies that can also benefit people of color with disabilities and people of all colors with and without disabilities, like universal designs that design at the margins to include much more than the mythical average student. We know there are barriers to advocacy when we stage events with really maybe the best of intentions, but without seeking best practices for putting on a conference like Susan has here that includes, you know, sign language interpretation or captioning or spacing, or allows for emotional support and service animals. We see barriers that relate to internalized ableism and people who don't feel that they have things to say because they've been taught their whole lives their voices don't matter. We don't have near enough funding across these advocacy groups that operate in silos and often compete for some of the same funding instead of coming together to see where their common concerns may be. PCA supports and the money following the person so that people can live in their own homes, like the Disability Integration Act is trying to affect, that has not been passed yet. There are barriers to Medicaid, and you know, there's articles that have been published about disabled people choosing divorce in order to maintain their Social Security or Medicaid because of these disincentives. The more I learn, the more work I realize there is to do. And there are also things that facilitate more effective disability advocacy. So organizations and independent living groups and even ADA celebrations can include things like leadership training and practice at self-advocacy. Practicing giving people an opportunity to tell their stories on the Hill, at their local legislators' offices is one way to get young people more involved early. And I mentioned a few others. I'll also mention some of our work on disability identification, which is a very personal thing, how one wants to be thought of around their various identities. But for some, disability is a proud group membership. And to the extent that we've studied people who claim disability as a proud signifier of who they are, the more likely they are to get involved in disability advocacy, and the more likely they are to have friends in the disability community with different kinds of impairments. And so there's real benefits to well-being when it comes to claiming one's membership in a group that has had many ancestors that have come before us lead the way. Confidence can be built. And the societal benefits cannot be underestimated. The talents that we can leverage and realize when more people are given options for working, whether at home or on the job site, or for fewer hours, or even on a voluntary basis. Disability advocacy is all about including disabled voices in the decision-making and making sure that we are not trying to reinvent the wheel or fit people into pre-existing boxes of what advocacy should look like. I'll mention that in surveys of corporate social justice that look at employers who employ disabled people, people want to frequent those businesses more. They recognize that people who hire diverse clientele will not only bring them additional business, but that disabled employees are some of the most loyal, hardworking, and I don't want to overgeneralize because I'm sure there's variation in every group, but they see less turnover among their disabled employees than they do among their non-disabled employees. And so making sure we're sharing the latest information on employment and that we're not afraid to say the word. There's a hashtag now, say the word disabled. People are increasingly proud of that affiliation. This is a slide that just talks about some of the job information that I already shared. Some 97% of employers rate the employment contributions of their disabled employees higher than their non-disabled peers in terms of safety measures in all kinds of different industries. We can come back and talk about that a little further. I know we're running down on time, so I just have a few more things that I want to bring to your attention, which is advocacy for, this is the presidential election is coming up. There will be additional opportunities for us to exercise the vote. And I don't know how many have been hearing the Center for American Progress reports on the number of places that are still inaccessible to disabled people to vote. Some 60% of voting places have been deemed inaccessible, either by virtue of the way they're laid out or the equipment that they require people to interface with. And so to some extent, maybe mail-in voting may help address some of that if that proceeds. There is a bill for the PEOPLE Act that's all about increasing funding for rectifying some of these inaccessible polling places. And I encourage folks to look into Crip the Vote. In particular, there is a report from the Center for American Progress on the 10 questions that we should all be asking of the presidential candidates going forward. They're finally, they being folks at the Center for American Progress, getting the presidential candidates to respond to a disability platform. This is a slide that talks about some additional legislation. The Home Design Act, the Inclusive Home Design Act, is something you can tell your legislators more about and educate your communities. It's just about having a few houses in every state or every city that are built for single story entrances with a bathroom and wider doors at no necessarily additional cost. These are very cost-effective solutions so people can visit one another when they may use equipment. The Disability Integration Act is another one that's all about making sure people can have the supports they need in their own homes. And I want to conclude by saying the window of opportunity is opening and that we can all do so much more to share, especially during these times of upheaval. This is a real opportunity, I think, to make people more aware as they are becoming aware of their own biases, of how we can do things differently. Much more work is needed. This is my last slide that incorporates disabled people as expert knowers. We need more interdependent options and approaches to care and to work, and more effective transitioning to high school. I can't tell you how many disabled students come to college from high school not wanting to tell anybody because they're afraid of being stigmatized. And so they wait till they fail until they request accommodations. What's key to consider is the extent to which disability advocacy is for disabled people, with disabled people, and by disabled people who are the experts when it comes to representing their concerns. So I'm going to stop there. I can talk a little bit more. There's a quote on this slide from President Obama from the 25th anniversary of the ADA that we've got to do better. And I'd love to hear from some of you. Thank you very much. I promised to make one mention of this, which is I was given 12 copies of my Ableism book at a discount from the publisher, and I'm willing to pass that discount on to those that either in the chat or through PayPal, send me your address, I'll send you a book. And if someone in the chat posted the answer to the trivia question, when was ableism first used, they will be getting a free book as well.
Well, I think we need to know the answer to be sure of that.
The answer?
We had a couple of people put some things in here.
Wow, I believe it's 1980. Let's see.
We've got a number of people said in the 1960s, including one saying specifically 1962, another specifically 1963. I couldn't come up with a specific individual person who used it, but I found 1960s as a generalized term.
1985, Indigo said.
That's what I wrote. I thought it was 1983 or 85. It was when it was first put on the page, maybe in some publication. I have it somewhere in the very beginning of the book, but I'm trying to look for it now too, so I can have that at my disposal. But do you want to open it up to questions?
Yeah, I've unmuted everybody, so if you may need to unmute yourself in addition to me unmuting you in the event you can't speak up, but you can either raise your hand or you can jump in. I'm looking to see if anybody's got a raised hand. I'm not seeing any raised hands, so
Well, I will jump in.
go ahead.
I'm got disabled involved in terms of age from arthritis, after hip surgery, and after osteoporosis diagnosis and things, so that I have to use a walker. And I've thought that a lot of my problem is that I've got a lot of ableist thinking in my mind. So I'll just deny the problem that I have. And, I think one natural support system for disability are people who are older who are in denial, but if they are freed to realize what they're dealing with themselves, they would be more supportive of the whole disability community. I guess that's not a conclusion. That's a
It's a share. Thank you for sharing that.
I have a question I'm curious about Michelle's thoughts or anyone else's thoughts. I don't know if you've seen, I really like, so the concept of a blind spot that is an aspect of one's psyche, behavior, including biases, thought patterns, frameworks. I really like that concept, like the unseen areas is like the best thing I've come up with. I saw, if Susan, you put lens. Just curious if anyone else has like words you use specifically for that concept of the part of oneself that one does not is not aware of.
So I'll try to speak to that a little. So in psychology, we talk about the unknown unconscious. So there's a lot of things that we can access when we are reminded of kindergarten. We can retrieve that. It may have been unconscious, but we can pull it into consciousness. But there are some introspective things about ourselves that we just are more embodied. Our recollection of what it's like to maybe have been a kid sitting in the sun and feeling that sun. There aren't necessarily words for it, so we don't have the memory of the words. But I bet there are other terms too that we often use the word implicit, unconscious, self-awareness. I think some people have music on in the background. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure who that is. I would mute them specifically if I knew which one.
That's okay.
I think he just muted himself. Elaine has a hand raised.
Elaine, go for it.
Yes. Well, this is huge. I'm so thankful because Michelle, you've really put it together in such, a concise, clear way. And thank you for that. One of the things is that it's extra complicated for those of us who have multiple disabilities because you're not supposed to do that.
You only get
How
one.
dare you, So it's especially complicated, even as we are now, with all that has happened. For example, I have friends of mine with significant physical disabilities who have, at least periodically, significant mental, psychological, behavioral, emotional things. And especially if you have both, the accommodations that you need are still not being provided. People with significant physical disabilities are not being provided personal assistance when they end up in the psych ward. They're just not. They're not provided with the physical rehabilitation that they will need if they're going to ever get back out and live independently. And it's still happening. And it's horrifying and terrifying. And so that's one of the reasons why, being who I am, I'm feeling compelled. I've been coming out most of my life. I'm a lesbian too. But coming out is an ongoing thing. It's not like you just do it and you're done. It's like there's layers upon layers upon layers of things that we have deep down inside of us that are sometimes triggered by things that happen in our current time or in our mind. Most people who know me know I'm the famous songwriter performer. She's so cool. She's so much fun. Yeah. But they don't know that I'm also the young woman who had periodic bouts of hysteria, that I've punched myself in the face so hard I gave myself a black eye, that I've cut myself. Now, thankfully, I never got stuck in those extreme self-destructive behaviors, but they kept emerging at various times. And it is still one of the deepest fears of most people to have a mental, emotional, psychological disability. And people, the consequences of dealing with that label are so profound and extreme. Or if you're labeled as being, you're not supposed to use the R word anymore, but, which I agree with, but, people that have intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, et cetera, the dehumanization of our people. There is a hierarchy among people with disabilities too that really needs to be broken down. So I'm encouraging everybody out who is involved here to seek within yourself those things that we need, all of us need to work on, while we also confront the ableism and disabiliphobia that we ourselves experience. And all the other forms of the isms, if we live in a society that teaches us to be awful to each other. So racism, sexism, all those other wonderful things that we do to hurt each other. So as people with disabilities, we have the opportunity to teach so much and to evolve so far. but only if we're willing to be honest and vulnerable.
Thank you for that. I would love to.
Anybody else want to say something? I see a whole bunch of people that I usually hear something from. Should I call on you?
No. I wonder if there were there was anything shared that folks may have had either a negative reaction to or just a question about, or I don't know. It's difficult to think about. There's so many ways in which we can tackle these issues, but if it depends on so many factors, it's like Elaine was just sharing, it can get so complicated that people then don't want to get involved. And I've been really interested in confronting and speaking out when I hear something or see something in a way that hopefully provokes a conversation. So just asking the question of someone who may say something ableist, what did you mean by that? Can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by that? You may kind of begin a conversation. Or can you tell me more about that? And then there's an opportunity. But I had included at the end some slides the one slide that included things that people have been heard saying that are ableist, to see if folks wanted to try to come up with solutions or suggestions of what we could say in response. But I'm really also very open to what others just want to know more about or push back against.
One of the things that I encounter a lot, I spend a lot of time on Yahoo Answers and Quora, answering people's questions about disability, because I find that the amount of misinformation that's distributed to be horrifying. But there seems to be a tremendous amount of interest in what the experience of disability is like. But the questions always are, what's the worst thing about being disabled? Or would you, if you could give up one of your disabilities, which one would you give up? Which one? I mean, they always want to sort of quantify disability in negative terms. And I think that one of the things that people with disabilities really need to hold on to is what's positive in being disabled. I mean, one of the things that I said to somebody just very recently was, I wouldn't be who I am today if I wasn't disabled. Most of my life would be entirely different and probably not as exciting, because I had to try really hard to do what I did, and I got pushed in all kinds of directions that I never would have been pushed. And so for me, disability has been a really positive life experience. And I don't think people who are able-bodied hear that enough. I think all they think of is disability as being something horrible, and that it's, better dead than disabled.
Michelle, Sam has a question in the chat.
I was just looking at that, Sam, and the question is, does anyone have insights about internalized relational or generational ableism? And it goes on to talk about, it's hard to separate from, my mom has disabilities, and it's hard to separate from her illnesses and the impact of her health conditions had on me while trying to build my disability identity. I would like to hear from others, but I will say that in some of the studies that we've been collating about who older adults in general tend to beliefs die harder, if you will. So I think there is some data that says that older adults are less likely to think certain things are disabilities, like invisible conditions I talked about at the very beginning. In national samples, 60% of older adults questioned whether some of these things that we clearly identify as disabling conditions today are truly should be disabilities that should be accommodated. So there is that sort of tendency for older adults to have harder, these ideas and justifications and ideologies that have been perhaps more entrenched and well practiced. That doesn't mean we can't dismantle and rethink things, but I've had some pessimistic students say they thought racism will finally be over as soon as the older adults die out. And I was like, what? Because the thought was that we need to move past, which seems really ageist to me, right? But I'm not sure if that's really what Sam was trying to get at too, that, does that help? I mean, I do think different age groups may not see any value in claiming a disability identity because it was always something they were taught that they have to overcome or hide in order to survive. And this is very different. This notion of claiming one's full self to not only reduce internalized ableism because you become aware that nothing's wrong with you, that what's wrong is the way other people interpret your life and whether or not you can participate in the way that makes the best sense for you, and whether there are options, and that these options shouldn't be called special needs if they're civil rights. And if we call them special needs, they may be less likely to be addressed or enforced as civil rights. I don't know if Sam, that helps. Well, good. Yes, we're going to record this.
Yes.
There's another question. How do you respond to business owners who see ADA compliance as the checkbox for people with disabilities and satisfying the end of their ableism? Alan has been approached by business owners in the past to explain that a bar with all high top tables and one low top in the back by the bathroom and the kitchen technically meets the regulation, but is not appropriate. Yeah, I want to do much better at this myself. And I think it starts with, I'm happy to send folks, I was able to do an interview on a radio station where people were asking about feeling bad for small businesses and poor small businesses who are sued, because Anderson Cooper actually did a big report making a big deal about what some had interpreted as overzealous lawyers in a few cities going after small businesses who hadn't complied with the ADA. Well, it turns out that while there were a couple law firms that were doing this, it was really the exception. And that most people, it's so hard to get a complaint filed at a bar or at a shop or any other public space that is smaller, that a lot of times, there are solutions that don't have to be taken to litigation. And maybe we need to be sharing with these storekeepers how they can become part of an app that lets disabled people, the largest minority in the world, know that they are welcoming of diversity, that they are open to feedback, that they can expand their profits, if you will, that people with and without disabilities want to frequent the businesses of those who are more inclusive, and that low chairs, in this particular case, may benefit a variety of people with temporary conditions who just want to lean on a stool and can't hop up there, that we need alternatives. So I'm happy to send that, but I think we could all do better at maybe to the point of not even frequenting businesses, of boycotting businesses if they refuse to comply. But I think there are also ways of giving them good press, writing a review of the business if they've done something to be more inclusive. That might be even more reinforcing.
Judith has a question in the chat.
Judith, do you report there are training resources for learning to do self-advocacy? I think I meant that more generally, that people need to be doing more self-advocacy, but there are certain organizations in each city. I went to Tennessee recently and they were doing a training but also that training was then going to be practiced and taken to Capitol Hill at the Nashville Capitol, where they had people of different age groups sharing their stories. Stories are so powerful with so many people, but legislators in particular who want to hear from mothers of children with disabilities, who want to hear from young people and what they're finding is problematic. And so I can see if I can locate some more to send. We'll save the group chat too, but I want to say that each individual city is trying to do more with getting, I mean, the disability rights movement wants to grow and they want more young people involved. And so what do young people need? They need practice with leadership. They need practice with advocacy. I think if you're teachers, you can do assignments for students that include the history of disabled people and their leaders. I live in a primarily Jewish neighborhood, and we do all kinds of projects about the Holocaust, but no one was including, you know, information that students could do projects on disabled people's experiences in the Holocaust. And so they did that 1 year and then it went away. I thought, well, that's not very helpful. But we need to keep pushing teachers to, you can share disability culture. My daughter and I used to go to different classrooms and allow students to ask questions, but also address some of their misunderstandings when they're younger and encourage them to ask for what they need. So with freshmen that I teach, we have lots of freshmen and a critical mass of students of color who come in, and I see many of them may not have documented disabilities. Maybe they can't afford to get the documentation, or they have an IEP or a 504 plan from high school, but they don't want to bring it. They want to try to start fresh in college. And so I try to teach all freshmen that you have learning strengths and challenges, and you need to be asking your professors to provide their notes in alternate formats, even if you don't have documentation, that you have the right as a paying student to ask to participate in the way that's most comfortable for you. So I think that frees students who are maybe afraid that they'll play the disability card or then be outed in class, which can happen. You can be outed by professors, and they need to be called on the carpet for that. But it encourages all students that self-advocacy is one of the leading predictors of completing a higher education degree, that you know how to ask for what you need.
The other thing about self-advocacy is it brings your voice to the world. I saw a very powerful movie by an autistic man, and his devotion is to advocate for the autistic community, his people. It was so powerful. This is a man who does not physically speak. He has to use a machine, and it works fine. He can do a fine job. But I hadn't even thought of advocating for myself for anything. But every time I see things where people are advocating for themselves, they are bringing out their humanity, and it brings out the humanity for everybody else. So I'm asking, in this case, for, like a webinar that I could go and watch, or some TV show. Like there was a delightful TV show about the man who had cerebral palsy. And he was a real person who had real cerebral palsy. It was his real story. It was a really good show, and it taught me an awful lot.
I'm going to try to find some things, Judith. Send me your email, but to share with the whole group, because one thing I take for granted is that some of us are inundated with these webinars and these things that are all about the latest in teaching for inclusion or increasing belonging or giving students choices, right, if they are dealing with chronic illness. And I can't keep up. I mean, I've been to so many amazing webinars, even from the private sector. So corporations and consultant firms that look to place big time academics and VPs, they're recognizing how important diversity is to the value of their workforce, because we have to be able to communicate with people who are different than us. People of color students of color are going to be in the majority this year. I mean, people got to get ready. And if they're fearful and misunderstanding,